Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for today's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. Zoom's live auto transcript function has been enabled for this event. If you would like to view the captions, you can find the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. At the bottom of the screen, you'll also see a few other icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. My colleague Ashley will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes that you'll purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy the conversation. Today, I have the great honor of introducing Fiston Mwanza Mujila and Bret Maney. Fiston Mwanza Mujila was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1981 and lives today in Austria. His debut novel, Tram 83, translated by Roland Glasser and published in English in 2015 by Deep Vellum, won the German International Literature Award and was longlisted for the International Man Booker and the Prix du Monde. In addition to The River and the Belly, he's the author of 2 more poetry collections and 3 plays. His second novel, The Villain's Dance, was published in France in 2020 and is forthcoming in English translation from Deep Vellum. Bret Maney is a literary critic and translator from French and Spanish. He is a recipient of several awards, including the 2020 Gulf Coast Translation Prize for his translation of Fiston's poetry and an International Latino Book Award and Penn Heim Translation Fund grant for his translation of Guillermo Coto Thurner's novel, Manhattan Tropics, which he also co-edited. He is assistant professor of English at Lehman College, City University of New York. And today's moderator, David Shook, is a poet, translator, and editor whose work has spanned a wide range of languages and regions. As the founder of Phoneme Media, now an imprint of Deep Vellum Publishing, they have edited award-winning books translated from 25 languages, including the first ever literary translations from Uyghur and Lingala. Their writing has appeared in The Guardian, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and World Literature Today, among many other publications. And last but certainly not least, thank you to Nicholas Elliott, who will be interpreting today's event for us. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now Fiston, Bret, and David.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Pierce. And thank you to Pierce and Ashley and everyone at the bookstore for hosting us today. We're going to kick off our event with our man of the hour, Fiston, and his wonderful translator, Bret, who will read a few poems from The River and the Belly.
Solitude 61. Dans mon ventre. Dans mon ventre. Dans mon ventre se confuse un fleuve, bougre et fainéant, sale et immense, lugubre et vilain. Un fleuve. Un fleuve, un fleuve, un fleuve en état avancé de dysenterie.
Solitude 61. A river convulses my belly, a confounded malingerer, dirty and immense, mournful and malign, a river in the late stages of dysentery.
Solitude 64, où la nausée précède l'essence. Je suis enceinte depuis 17 ans, 36 mois et 2 jours. Je fais l'amour avec le ciel. J'attends un mioche du ciel. L'enfant qui sortira de mon ventre, ou le fleuve qui sortira de mes tripes, ou l'enfant fleuve que crachera mon corps saligo, viendra avec sa viande remplir mes longues nuits d'insomnie. Il répondra, oh non, le fleuve et l'enfant. Il répondra, il répondra, oh non, c'était en bila, bazo kata, ezo kola, c'était en bila, bazo kata, ezo kola. Il répondra, l'enfant qui sortira de mon ventre, c'était en bila, bazo kata, ezo kola, c'était en bila, bazo kata, ezo kola. Je pourrais alors me targuer à qui veut l'entendre d'être le père et la mère de cette progéniture floue, de cette progéniture scolopendre, de cette progéniture crevaison et inutilement grotesque.
Solitude 64, or nausea, is prior to essence. I have been pregnant for 17 years, 36 months, and 2 days. I make love to the sky. I'm expecting a child with the sky, the child who comes out of my belly, or the river born from my loins, or the river child my misbegotten body spits out, will fill long nights of insomnia with its flesh. The child will go by the name of Nzete Yamambila Bazokata Enukola. Then will I be able to boast to any who will listen of being mother and father to this blurred creature, to this centipede creature, to this flat tire creature, so needlessly grotesque.
That was wonderful. Thank you both. I'm going to kick off a little conversation, and then we'll have these two gentlemen read a few more poems about midway through our event today before we open up to some questions from all of you in the audience. I recall in one of our first conversations, Bret, you mentioned to me something that we just witnessed, which is Fiston's incredible talent as a performer. And what you said to me about this manuscript, about the river in the belly, was that in some ways it was almost like sheet music for Fiston to use as a kind of baseline from which to riff and bring his poetry to life. And I wondered if the two of you could talk about that. I see, I wonder if the influence of the oral tradition is a part of that. I also think about the influence of music, jazz, of course, but perhaps even more powerfully Congolese genres and traditions.
Sure, David, thank you. I couldn't help but smile while Fiston was reading, because it's impossible to follow a performance like that. But translation is itself about impossibility and impossible acts. And I think we saw that kind of manifested in the gap, the décalage between two renderings in two languages. And in terms of thinking of Flood or The River in the Belly as a script, and which literally became a script, and Fiston may be able to speak a little bit more, for example, about the way this poetry collection was turned into a theatrical piece in Germany after it was first published in Austria. But I mean, in interviews and in kind of criticism, Fiston, as a poet and novelist, has spoken about using words as musical notes. Les mots sont comme des notes, I think he said in an interview at one point. And while perhaps in kind of Western criticism of his work, some of these metaphors can be overblown at times, nonetheless, this is a text where we really do see some of those analogies hold up. While you were speaking, I thought immediately of the fact that, and this came up in our editorial process, David, there was an odd bit of punctuation, a question mark enclosed in parentheses, and we didn't know what to do with it. We thought, well, maybe this is some German form of punctuation, because the original book was published in Austria. And we investigated and we queried Fiston about it, and he told us that no, as a matter of fact, essentially, when he put a question mark in parentheses, he meant it as a guide to the poem's intonation, so kind of index to the orality of this text, When he put a question mark in parentheses, he meant that the reader could vocalize the poem, and that particular line is either a question, interrogatively or declaratively. We included that as a note in the back of the text to allow the reader to understand and grasp the poet's intentions, and that this text does function as a script and can be analogized to a kind of sheet music for a oral performance. I'll let Fiston take over after that. I don't know, Nicholas, if you want to render the question to French or if Fiston just wants to jump in.
Fiston had mentioned that he would be okay. Fiston, vous pouvez y aller, vous avez compris?
Oui, c'était par rapport à la question de la musique dans ma poésie.
Oui.
Ouais, en fait, pour moi, je pense que la musique, elle est essentielle parce qu'elle fait partie de la vie en République démocratique du Congo. Donc, on chante quand il y a un événement heureux ou même malheureux, quand il y a un mariage, une naissance ou n'importe quel événement, les gens chantent. Et donc, voilà. Donc, la musique fait partie vraiment du Congo, du Congolais. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose fait partie de la société congolaise de manière générale.
So for me, music is essential because it is part of life in the Democratic Republic of Congo. People there sing when there are happy events and even unhappy events. A marriage, a birth, any important event is going to be accompanied by music. So it's really part of life in the Congo.
Et donc, dans mes textes, j'essaie aussi d'interroger la littérature. La littérature, est-ce le texte ou la musique qui découlerait du texte? Pour moi, c'est un travail aussi qui me tient à cœur de voir, d'interroger la littérature de manière générale. Pour moi, je considère, ce qui est important pour moi, c'est pas seulement le contenu, mais c'est aussi le contenant ou le rythme. Qu'est-ce qui fait un texte? C'est pas seulement le thème, mais ça peut être aussi le rythme, l'ambiance, l'atmosphère que dégagerait un texte.
My texts try to question literature and ask, is it text or is it music? And that's something that's extremely important in my work to me, which is to question literature in that way. It's important to ask, is it the content or the form, the rhythm, the pace that makes the literature? Is it not so much the theme, but in fact, perhaps the rhythm, the atmosphere that comes from the text?
Et donc, j'essaie de m'inspirer, je m'inspire non seulement du jazz ou de la tradition africaine, mais j'essaie à mon niveau de créer une performance à partir de ma propre subjectivité. J'utilise beaucoup le rire dans les performances, j'utilise beaucoup je chante d'intonation. Pour moi, ça fait partie d'un travail que j'ai amorcé depuis plusieurs années.
So I try to inspire myself not only from jazz, from the tradition of free jazz, but also when I create a performance from my own subjectivity. I use laughter a lot in my performances. I use changes of intonation in my performances. These are important aspects.
Fiston, I wonder if I could follow up on what you just said about content versus form and the importance of rhythm and atmosphere in a literary text. Because, of course, we all know, and in many ways, you were first introduced to an English language readership through your fiction, and particularly through Tram 83, whose translator, Roland Glasser, is here with us today. Is there a difference for you between, that idea of the importance of form when it comes to fiction versus poetry? I know one of the great things about Tram 83, and one of the things that critics and readers alike have praised, is how atmospheric it is is how successfully it evokes Congolese nightlife, essentially.
En fait, pour moi, ce qui est important, c'est pas seulement pour moi, j'écris de pièces de théâtre, de romans et puis de nouvelles, mais ce qui crée, qui fait les liens entre mes imaginaires, entre ma littérature, c'est la poésie. Moi, je considère la poésie comme étant la colonne vertébrale de mon travail d'écrivain.
So for me, what's important is not just, I write plays, novels, short stories, but what really links my different forms of imagination, my different literatures, is poetry. For me, poetry is the spine of my writing.
Et donc, pour moi, le drame, c'est peut-être même un recueil de poésie. Les pièces de théâtre sont aussi de textes assez poétiques. Donc, c'est la poésie qui fait le lien. Et donc, moi, je travaille, j'utilise une poésie qui est assez, je dirais, assez musicale. Donc, quand j'écris, j'essaie de sentir la langue, j'essaie de travailler la langue. Donc, il y a un lien, je dirais, physique, charnel, manuel avec la langue. Voilà.
So for me, the foundation is the poetry collection. Even my short story collections are quite poetic. So poetry creates a link. The musical aspect of poetry, for instance, is a way of working the language. The language is a physical, carnal link in the flesh.
Et donc, le point commun entre mes romans, ma poésie ou mes pièces de théâtre, c'est que quand j'écris, à la fin, j'essaie toujours de dire le texte, de lire le texte à haute voix, de trouver je dirais, pour chaque texte, un rythme. Et donc, il y a certains de mes textes, comme dans Drame, j'utilise beaucoup le rythme de vieux trains qui traversent le Congo. Dans d'autres textes, comme dans le fleuve dans le ventre, il y a le rythme du fleuve qui inonde la plage, du fleuve qui engouffre le bateau, du fleuve qui déchante, du fleuve qui chante. C'est ce fleuve Congo qui se révolte, qui se rebelle, qui se suicide dans l'océan.
The common factor in my novels, my plays, my short stories, my poems is that the end of writing something, I always try to say it out loud, to read it out loud, and to find the rhythm of each text. So, for instance, in Tram, the rhythm is that of these old trains crossing the landscape of Congo. In The River in the Belly, it's the river's rhythm. It's the river moving against the beach, the river pulling a boat along, the river singing, the river revolting and rebelling, the river committing suicide into the ocean.
Et donc, pour moi, le texte, c'est vraiment une prison parce que les mots sont enfermés. Et donc, les mots ont besoin d'être dits, d'être chantés, d'être aboyés pour revivre, pour apprendre à vivre. Et donc, pour moi, je considère la performance comme la continuité de l'écriture.
For me, the text is like a prison because the words are locked in. They need to be said, to be sung, to be barked in order to be alive, to become alive. So for me, the performance is like a continuation of the writing.
That brings me to something Bret and I have also discussed in the process of editing the book, and a question I'd like to ask Bret about the translation. One, as Fiston was talking about the importance or even how essential it is to embody the language of the poetry, I wondered if that had led to any particular challenges or perhaps if you had employed any particular strategies, Bret, in achieving the same thing in translation, and whether that was different from other translation projects you had worked on. And then, this is becoming quite an onerous question, but I also wondered, we were talking about translation as something equally unfinished, as as proof that a text is unfinished and has further life, can be extended further. Could you talk about those things?
Yes, and I must say I'm still lingering on this image of the text as a prison that Fiston just mentioned, and Nicholas interpreted for us. And I did want to add that having spent now a couple of years translating Fiston's poetry, and realizing, as he just said now, that the poetry, while he's best known in, I think, probably in all contexts, but especially Anglophone context as a novelist, the poetry is his spinal cord. It is a kind of genre out of which emerges his other texts. And I think part of the prison that we're thinking through are also kind of different generic prisons, the ways in which the genres Fiston is writing out of and is inspired by, not only are themselves kind of oriented towards a kind of liberation, such as free jazz, but also the ways in which Western generic categories don't always map onto the categories such as, for example, the Casala, a praise poem that Fiston uses, or others, or the Solitude, which he invents as kind of sui generis genre or type of poem he invents for this particular collection. So the idea of the prison is a resonant one, and one that is why I think it's so important to be attentive to his performance of these works. And certainly as a translator, one way I might say prime myself for translating is listening to Fiston read some of his poems. There are recordings of him reading in French from Le Fleuve dans le Ventre, this collection, The River in the Belly. I find that helpful. I would probably find that helpful too, because so much contemporary English language poetry is written for the page, and that is not a tradition that Fiston is primarily working out of. So the page, the white space on the page, the kind of a lot of the aesthetic elements that go into kind of contemporary U.S. English language poetry have to be, I think, rethought, or at least that needs to be kept present in the translator's mind as he works with Fiston's text. I probably responded to some of your question, David. I feel free to prompt me again if there was something I missed there. But.
No, that was really wonderful. I too love the image of the prison, and perhaps it's a bit romantic, but as an editor of literature and translation, I love the extension that translation might be a way of breaking out of that prison, or at least building a new one. This is such a tight book. In many ways, I think of it as a single long poem, or as variations on a poem, or riffing. And I know, Fiston, that some of your other collections, and here I'm thinking particularly of your Casala poems, which will be forthcoming from Deep Vellum in Bret's translation. I'm interested in how you conceive of a collection, how you come to something so cohesive.
If I can Fiston, si tu peux t'approcher un peu plus au microphone, on ne t'entend pas très très bien. Merci.
Comme ça.
Désolé.
Comme ça, c'est bon?
Oui, c'est mieux. Merci.
Ok. En fait, moi, je m'inspire beaucoup aussi du Casala. Casala, c'est un genre littéraire traditionnel qui consiste en un louange, c'est-à-dire l'exécuteur du Casala, les chanteurs, dit des choses, des belles paroles, soit sur lui-même, soit sur le monde, sur lui-même, sur sa famille, sur des personnages réels, fictifs ou même historiques. Mais il y a aussi une deuxième forme de Casala qui est, je dirais, mémorielle. parce que le chanteur restitue la mémoire d'une famille, d'un clan, d'une société. Et dans le Kassala, il y a toujours deux moments qui sont importants. Le premier moment, c'est que les chanteurs respectent la vérité historique, mais en même temps, il peut improviser. Et donc, c'est ce qui m'intéresse dans le Kassala. Et donc, quand j'ai travaillé sur ce recueil, donc, j'ai essayé de raconter l'histoire de ma famille. J'ai essayé de raconter ma propre histoire tout en improvisant. Le Kassala a beaucoup de liens avec je pense que ça a beaucoup de liens avec le blues, même avec la musique soul. Parce que c'est un chant qui parle de la famille, du passé, de l'exil, de la séparation, de la mort, de la vie. Donc, le Kassala a toujours quelque chose de triste, parce que, voilà, on évoque quelque chose qui n'existe pas.
J'arrive. So I'm also very inspired by Kasala, which is a traditional literary form, a form of praise, which is to say that the person performing the Kasala, the singer, is going to say kind words or beautiful words about himself, his family, about fictional or non-fictional characters, historical characters. There's also a second form of Kasala, which is memorial. In other words, it's a form where the memory of a family or a society is reconstructed. For me, there are two important moments in Kasala. The first is that one must respect the historical truth, but can also improvise. And so for me, when I use Kasala in my work in The River in the Belly, I'm telling my family's story, my own story. I have to be faithful to it, but I can also improvise. So in a sense, there's a lot of links there to the blues, to soul music, because Kasala, like those forms, talks about family, the soul, separation, death. Kasala is a sad form because there's always something in it that no longer exists.
That's really interesting and really beautiful. And I think it's clear, it will be clear to readers of this collection, which I encourage you to purchase through our host bookstore, will see as they discover the text. I want to take a moment just to appreciate Nicholas for his translation today, his interpretation. I know this is not easy, and particularly when we're talking about such complex subject matter. So thank you, Nicholas.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to ask now if Fiston and Bret will read a few more poems before we continue our conversation. I have a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to our audience. But for now, Fiston, could you take it away?
Yeah. Solitude 86. Le fleuve. Le fleuve Congo n'a rien envié aux autres fleuves. Ils possèdent leur bave, leur érection et leur virulence à vous foutre la trouille. Tout compte fait, il n'a même pas besoin d'allocation familiale, ni d'un quelconque visa pour être un fleuve. Il a été un fleuve. Il est un fleuve et restera un fleuve sans nationalité, un fleuve libre, un fleuve indépendant, un fleuve majuscule, un fleuve.
Solitude 86. The Congo has no reason to envy other rivers. It's got their froth, their hard-on, and the virulence to scare you stiff. At the end of the day, it doesn't even need to take the family deduction or apply for a visa to be a river. It was a river, it is a river, it will remain a river without nationality, a free river, an independent river, an uppercase river, a river.
Solitude 19. Au nom d'une certaine paix, après nous avoir confisqué les 2 kivous, après avoir arraché le diamant, le cuivre, le cobalt, le coltan et l'uranium, après avoir brûlé nos terres, après avoir rasé les écoles et les hôpitaux, après avoir coupé l'électricité, après avoir violé nos grands-mères et réduit en esclavage nos mères, après avoir castré nos pères et condamné aux travaux forcés nos oncles, après avoir saboté le barrage Inga, après avoir profané nos cimetières, et après nous avoir interdit de pleurer nos morts, arriveront-ils à transporter le fleuve Congo et à s'en servir comme eau de chambre? Ce n'est pas une question. Ça peut ou ne pas être un secret de polichinelle. Le fleuve Congo noyera quiconque touchera à un de ses cheveux.
Solitude 19. In the name of some kind of peace, after seizing both kivus, after taking our diamonds, copper, cobalt, coltan, and uranium, after torching our fields, after trashing our schools and hospitals, after cutting our electricity, after raping our grandmothers and reducing our mothers to sexual slaves, after castrating our fathers and condemning our uncles to forced labor, after sabotaging the Inga Dam, after desecrating our cemeteries and keeping us from mourning our dead, will they also find a way? Will they also find a way? Will they also find a way to haul away the Congo River and use it as room freshener? This is not a question. It may or may not be an open secret. The river will drown anyone who so much as touches a hair on its head.
Solitude 23. Mon premier rêve était de faire carrière comme saxophoniste. Mon dernier rêve, devenir un fleuve, le Congo ou le Niger, qu'importe, et passer calmement mes journées loin de ce guerre que vous exportez et de ces famines qui font de vous de Père Noël intemporel et autres bons samaritains. Le théâtre dans tout ça. Vous offrez avec la main gauche et vous arrachez avec la main droite. Le théâtre dans tout ça. Vous donnez avec les 2 mains, galeuses d'ailleurs, puis vous courez raconter vos inepties des sauveurs de l'humanité et autres somnambules de Père Noël, envoyés expressément sur Terre pour nous aider avec du riz, du savon, du sel, de l'huile de palme, de la farine de manioc, de capote et du jus de joujou. Le théâtre dans tout ça. Vous maintenez l'absurde et ce théâtre de l'absurde.
Solitude 23. My first dream was to play sax, my last to become a river, the Congo or the Niger, little it matters, and spend my days at peace, far from these wars you export and these famines that let you play at being proverbial Santa Clauses and good Samaritans. What an act. You give with the left hand what you snatch away with the right. What an act. You give with both hands, scabby ones besides. And then you run to brag of your exploits as saviors of humanity and sleepwalking Santa Clauses expressly put on the face of the earth to grant us rice, soap, salt, palm oil, cassava flour, condoms, and juju juice. What an act. You keep up the absurd and this theater of the absurd.
That was beautiful.
Okay.
Go
Merci,
ahead.
David. Tu veux finir par le 44?
Ouais, je peux lire le 44.
OK.
Ouais.
Et puis on s'arrête.
Solitude 44, qu'ils psalmodient le Brahmapoutre, qu'ils exhibent le Yangtze-Kiang, qu'ils encensent le Zambèze, qu'ils affichent l'Euphrate, qu'ils pérorent la Meuse, qu'ils chantent le Guadalquivir, qu'ils élisent le Mississippi et ses gendres, à savoir l'Arkansas, le Missouri et l'Ohio. Je brandirai le Congo, le seul fleuve qui déconcentre, le seul fleuve qui simule la tuberculose, le seul fleuve qui danse le tango, la salsa, le boléro, le flamenco et le cha-cha-cha. Le seul fleuve qui vous réchigne, le seul fleuve qui broute de la viande, le seul fleuve qui se suicide dans l'océan, jambes jointes et bras croisés. Je donne ma main à couper et mon cou à trancher et mon corps à castrer s'il s'avère que je fais usage de faux. Déjà, je suis castré et minable tel le Limpopo à ses heures perdues. En tout état de cause, que craindrais-je? La masturbation forcée, le preuve du Cambi ou l'assassinat déguisé en noyade dans les eaux de ce fleuve, de ce même fleuve.
Thank you, Fiston. Solitude 44, a poem that takes us back to the Congo River, really at the center of this collection, and also tips into some of our own North American geographies. Let him praise the Brahmaputra. Let him write home about the Yangtze. Let him acclaim the Zambezi. They can flaunt the Euphrates, go on about the Muz, sing the Guadalquivir, elect the Mississippi and its sons-in-law, the Arkansas, the Missouri, and the Ohio. I brandish the Congo, the only river that saps your concentration, the only river that fakes tuberculosis, the only river that dances the tango and salsa and bolero and flamenco and the cha-cha-cha, the only river that thumbs its nose at you, the only river that eats meat, the only river that offs itself in the ocean, legs together, arms crossed. I'll give you my hand to cut off, my neck to wring, my body to castrate, if what I say isn't true. In any case, I'm already castrated, in a sad sack like the Limpopo in its spare hours. In any case, what do I have to fear? Forced masturbation? Diambi test? Or murder disguised as drowning in the waters of this very river?
Wow. Thank you both. That was beautiful. Bret, I'd like to ask you a question about the challenges and exciting opportunities that translating this book presented. I know there's a huge amount of research that went into this. I was just looking over some of our notes and conversations we had about the aspirated, voiceless, palato-alveolar, sibilant, affricative, and Lubumbashi Swahili. I remember looking up other things that we weren't sure whether they were inventions of Fiston's or references to Congolese culture that we simply couldn't find online in English. Tell me about some of those challenges, broadly speaking, as you see them, both in terms of those sorts of things, but also in terms of capturing the tone and voice of Fiston's poetry, which is so distinctive.
All right, thank you, David. There's so many places we could go with a question like that, and you in reading out some of our notes, I think call attention to one of the valuable aspects. I mean, there's downsides too, but to having kind of academic and the academically trained translator, because there is that proclivity to dive into research as an interior moment to translation. And the notes were a fun part of that. You know, as we envisioned them, one of the things we knew we really wanted to do in this text was to preserve the indigenous African languages, primarily the Lingala, but also the Swahili, and more specifically the kind of Katangan Swahili in the text. So that was essential, and it was something I asked Fiston about because this text had been translated into German beforehand. And what Fiston said was, the translator into German had ambitions of doing something like this, but then was overwhelmed because in every page there is some cultural reference, there's a nuance of Congolese history, there's a quote or a phrase or a saying in Lingala about the river or of daily life that pops up. And so, but nonetheless, we dove in and we persisted, and I think we have, as a result, this really important glossary notes to the text, and important because while many translations would preserve the indigenous African languages, without some kind of glossary for most readers, including for most African readers, because Lingala is a relatively small language, the phrases would remain as kind of almost unpronounceable opacities within the text, as non-semantic content, as what Roland Barthes once referred to as a kind of like a reality effect, and when other languages are mixed into a text, reminding you that this text wasn't originally written, let's say, in English. And so through some of that kind of background work, I think we were able to maintain something I'm proud of, the polyphony of the text. And I think our pride is that a member of the Congolese diaspora in the U.S. picking up this book would find in the notes accurate translations of Lingala and a very accurate situation of the text within the moment in which it was written at this particular moment in 2011. So that gets to this question of the polyphony of Fiston's writing, so apparent here, and the way in which it is anchored in history under the two Kabila who were presidents of the DRC at a time when this book is thinking about that time, but it's also looking back to a period of what would correspond with Mwanza Mujila's boyhood, and thinking about Mobutu and the end of the Mobutu regime, and as well, of course, the Congolese Rumba, which is so present in the text. So it's always an education to work with Fiston. He's a very generous author in responding to my questions and being patient as I then request further kind of clarifications and to what he has to share and what he said. I will say that this is the first book I've done. It's my second book, but it's the first book I've done with a living author. And so that, as a translator, that is a totally different experience because there is someone you can ask. I can send a WhatsApp message to Fiston or send him an email, and he'll respond to me. But also, just thinking as a translator too, some translators prefer working with dead authors because the living author is the monitory presence. And especially when you're translating into English, a language in which many writers, including Fiston, have some access to, they're a monetary presence kind of viewing or overlooking your work. And Fiston has always been a very generous one. But that's that was a big part of the experience of translating this book.
Bret, do you recall any, on a kind of more granular level, any particularly challenging phrases or lines?
Let's see. I feel like there's many places kind of we could go. I mean, I will say with maybe not diving into the explanation, but I think the last poem in the book, the last verb of the book, was one that David and Fiston and I spoke about and talked about and went back and forth on, and what verb to use in the final poem in this book, which perhaps, David, if you have it available, perhaps you could read out loud for us, and we can maybe just say something about kind of our thought process in choosing that verb and working from the French and in concert with Fiston.
Certainly, yeah, I have it right here in this beautiful book you can get from Brookline Booksmith. It is Solitude 87C. And I apologize for not having practiced Fiston's laugh earlier, but I swallow my spit, since I refuse to feed on the crumbs that fall from your tables, lest eucalyptus and mango trees invade my belly.
All right. So I can start by saying something that looking at reviews of the original text here, a lot of reviewers, including in I think mostly, these reviews are mostly done in Germany and Austria, read the crumbs here that the poet refuses to swallow as Western philanthropy, falling from Western tables. That here we have the African poet or speaker in the poem refusing to swallow these crumbs, these ungenerous, these kind of ungenerous, but also potentially dangerous substance and sustenance being provided to the poet, and that was a predominant reading we found. But then in talking to Fiston about this enigmatic last poem, he explained to us that the poet here, the speaker, doesn't want to eat the crumbs from the table for fear that they will be transformed into his belly. And I think it's important here that we're ending this collection, The River in the Belly, by returning to and centering the belly. He doesn't want to eat the crumbs for fear that they'll be transformed in his belly into grotesque plantations. The crumbs are, in other words, a kind of malignant seed that the speaker of the poem is fearful of ingesting. And it's not clear from the poem, although, as I said, in kind of European criticism of this collection, it's often seen as Western philanthropy. Who's providing these crumbs? And indeed, Fiston spoke to Fiston about it. You know, we talked about it as perhaps a Congolese politician doing a favor for the speaker of the poem, who would then become indebted to him. And so, thinking about that verb and the kind of invasiveness of these malignant seeds entering the belly of the speaker of the poem, thinking about the possibility of this having a kind of anti-colonial meaning, but also thinking about the history of agriculture within the Democratic Republic of the Congo, thinking about Belgian plantations that existed in the Belgian Congo prior to independence. We ended up settling on this verb to end the poem of invade as a way of gesturing towards that kind of poetic imaginary. And yet there were other alternatives we considered, like to sprout up, to take root, to grow in that much more neutral. And we went back and forth about this for a long time, and these are I think the kinds of questions that translators are engaged in, and what it means to, in essence, to riff on an original text, much as Fiston riffs on these poems as a kind of script and performing them in rendering this version in English, which is not the sole version, but a version of a possible version of Fiston's collection. So that's one example of just kind of how much thought went into this final verb on which the collection ends.
Yeah, that's a great example, Bret, and I feel like we could unpack some of those things and extend this conversation another hour. But for now, we have a number of questions from our audience, and I'd love to pose those to you. First, we have a question for Fiston, and you referenced this earlier, but I'll go ahead and ask you. Stacy Hardy asks, can you talk about the place of laughter in your work? Your performance made me think of fellas shuffling and smiling.
La place du rire dans ma poésie, c'est ça?
We Oui, c'est pouvez-vous parler de la place du rire dans votre poésie? Et pour cette personne, elle a pensé à une chanson de Fela Kuti, Suffering and Smiling, en vous entendant.
Ah, en fait, pour moi, le rire fait partie vraiment de mon univers comme écrivain et comme poète. Je me définis comme un écrivain heureux. Donc, je ne peux pas écrire si je suis malheureux. Donc, je suis obligé d'être dans une phase de bonheur, de plénitude, de béatitude pour écrire.
So for me, laughter is part of my universe as a writer and a poet. I define myself as a happy writer. So I can't write if I'm in an unhappy phase. I need to write in a state of happiness, beatitude.
Et donc, pour moi, voilà. Donc, j'utilise le rire dans mes performances parce que pour moi, je trouve que c'est un médium qui me permet même moi-même d'être en fait, de faire un travail sur moi-même. Donc, quand je suis sur scène, je suis dans un monde, je dirais, comme dans une atmosphère, je pense que la poésie, c'est quelque chose de rituel. Je suis comme dans une phase comme dans une cérémonie. Et donc, après chaque performance, j'ai comme l'impression que j'arrive à atteindre je dirais, j'arrive à atteindre une phase de plénitude. Donc, la performance a un rôle sur ma personne.
I want to just add to that in terms of a kind of.
Maybe I could translate.
Oh,
sorry to interrupt, but I'll
sorry.
forget. Thank you.
Sorry, my bad.
J'utilise wait, I'm translating into English. Yeah. I use laughter in my performances because I feel like that medium allows me to even do work on myself. On stage, I'm in a world, in an atmosphere. I think poetry is like a ritual. So on stage, I'm in a world and an atmosphere that's like a ceremony. And after each performance, I manage to reach a phase of fullness in well-being. And so performance has an actual impact on me.
Donc, pour finir, il y a dans certaines traditions africaines, il y a toujours, les gens ont l'habitude de rire quand il y a même des événements malheureux. Donc, voilà. Par exemple, il y a des cassalas qui sont faites, qui sont dits quand quelqu'un décède. Et le musicien ou le chanteur de cassala essaie même de faire de blagues en rappelant la mémoire du disparu. Donc, pour moi, le rire participe à ce quelque chose je dirais, comment on dit en français, en français. Donc, le rire participe à un travail also, je m'excuse parce que là, je traduis parfois de l'allemand au français, comme je ne pratique pas le français au quotidien. Donc, voilà. Donc, le rire participe me permet moi-même comme auteur de pouvoir éprouver de la joie sur scène. Et la référence de Fela Kuti, elle est là. Fela Kuti, c'est un musicien c'est l'un des meilleurs saxophonistes africains, au même titre que Hugues Masekela pour la trompette. Voilà. Ce sont des références. Voilà.
So just to finish off, in some African traditions, people are used to laughing even when there are unfortunate events. For instance, there are some kasala that are spoken when people die, and the singer, the kasala performer, tries to make jokes in memory of the deceased. So laughter is part of a work of I have to apologize because I'm trying to translate from German to French. I don't speak French on a daily basis. So the thing to say is that laughter allows me to feel joy on stage. As for the reference to Fela Kuti, yes, it's there. He's one of the best African saxophone players. The way that Hugh Masekela is with the trumpet, he's absolutely a reference.
Thank you. And I had wanted to add, in listening to Fiston's response and to that question about laughter and Fiston invokes happiness, I put a link in a chat to a poem by Fiston called "I Sing My Blue Sun," that is kind of an Ars Poetica poem by Fiston about his art of poetry, in which he writes, among other lines, "I must be happy to write, even when the text itself is a cartography of violence or reels with dysentery." So he speaks some more to those issues in that particular poem. I encourage you to check out.
Wonderful. We have a question from Greg Cantor for you both. He asks, when Fiston's poetry moves from French to English and intertwines cultures, do you feel that the music and rhythms naturally translate and that they are somehow universal? Or do you need to recreate the music and build new rhythms for new languages?
I guess I have to take that one. And naturally translate. I don't know. In some ways, I think that the right person to judge that would be the poet Fiston himself. And I expect just in ways that our own readings of poetry today diverge in important ways, that the translations do too, and that the kind of certain rhythms in a context, cultural and otherwise, inherent to Fiston's writing is going to find a new home and sometimes unexpected new bedfellows within English and within its own system of musical reference. I mean, I think most directly to your question, I mean, the Congolese rumba, the soukous, that is so essential to this work, and I think it's something that, as we think about Fiston's work in English, will be very interesting to explore in Roland Glasser's forthcoming translation, The Villain's Dance, as well, where the rumba and the soukous also play a very significant role. But how does that transfer to an Anglophone context in which many readers are going to be much less familiar with the history of the Congolese rumba and the references that the poet, that the author is making? I think I also take I would take a certain kind of I don't know if satisfaction is not the word, but that the text itself, the poems themselves, can be voiced, and they can also be voiced. I have produced a translation that can then be voiced in many ways, and in certain rhythms and tonalities and connections can be asserted and reasserted through that performance. And I take heart in that fact too, that the translation has been published, but it's not finished. The performance is a continual revitalization and reimagining of that published text.
Yeah,
There was, David. Yeah, sorry. I think there was another question I responded to in the chat, and I may have made it disappear into the answered category, but I just wanted to mention that in case you hadn't seen it. But I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I was going to mention that question, which is from Sydney Mantram, and we have two more questions. I'm going to ask our participants here to answer them quickly because we're bumping up against the end of our time. Sydney asked, French has a special way of being sung, and when you read it, sounds like singing. Do you say the words like singing on purpose, or is Congolese French more expressively spoken?
Pour moi, la langue française, c'est comme un fleuve. Et un fleuve n'existe pas sans ses affluents. Ce sont les affluents qui nourrissent le fleuve. Et donc, mon français est nourri non pas seulement du lingala, mais aussi du swahili, de l'allemand, de plusieurs langues, et même du chuluba. Pour moi, je dirais 5 langues: l'allemand, le français, l'allemand, le swahili, le lingala et le chulu.
Pardon, quelle était la dernière langue que vous avez dit?
Le chiluba.
Le Churuba, d'accord. For me, the French language is like a river, and a river doesn't exist without its tributaries. So for me, the tributaries are Lingala, Swahili, German, even Churuba.
Oui, oui. Et donc, j'essaie de créer ma langue française. Et donc, cette langue française que j'essaie de créer, elle est musicale. Voilà. Parce que elle est inspirée aussi par le rythme africain, bien que c'est une langue française, mais il y a le rythme du kassala, il y a le rythme du fleuve. Donc, pour moi, quand j'écris, j'essaie de mettre dans cette langue-là le Congo. Le Congo, parce que le Congo, c'est un pays où il n'y a pas de juste, je dirais, de juste mesure. Tout est toujours en excès. Donc, j'essaie de mettre dans cette langue-là le Congo dans sa démesure, le Congo avec ses fleuves, ses lacs, ses guerres de libération, son soleil. Et donc, voilà, tout se travaille dans la langue.
I try to create my own French language, and that French is musical. It's inspired by African languages. It's inspired by the rhythms of Kassala, the rhythms of the river. When I write, I try to put Congo into that French language. Congo, because Congo is a country where nothing is ever just the right size, at the right scale. It's a country of excess. I try to put in its rivers, its lakes, its sunlight.
It's a very beautiful answer, Fiston. Thank you. I love the idea of French as a river, of language as a river, and I also love your mention of the idiolect, of your own French, of the many Frenches that exist. We have one final question, another from Stacy, who says, I hear shades of both Sunny Labutansi in your work, but also Chikaya Utamsi. Can you talk about your work in relation to this lineage?
Chikaya Utamsi est l'un des grands poètes de la République populaire du Congo. Donc, il y a deux Congos, il y a le Congo Kinshasa et le Congo Brazzaville, séparés par un fleuve. Et les deux pays ont les capitales les plus rapprochées au monde. Chikaya Utamsi, c'est un poète de Brazzaville, tout comme Soli Labutansi, qui fut aussi un grand romancier du Congo Brazzaville.
Pardon, j'ai eu un problème de son. Chikaya Tamsi est un poète de quel Congo, s'il vous plaît?
Tous les deux poètes sont du Congo-Brazzaville.
Congo-Brazzaville. D'accord.
Et le Congo Kinshasa. Et les deux pays sont séparés par un fleuve, ou reliés par un fleuve, c'est seulement le fleuve Congo.
D'accord. So, Chikaya Tamsi, as well as Soni Labutansi, are great poets of Congo-Brazzaville. There are two Congos which are separated by a river, and Chikaya Tamsi is from Congo-Brazzaville.
Et donc, pour moi, ce sont deux écrivains qui ont eu à m'inspirer quand j'ai commencé à écrire. Hein. Et donc, je me situe dans la lignée, dans la généalogie de poètes comme Chikaya Utamsi, comme Soni Labutansi, parce que ce sont des écrivains qui faisaient aussi un travail important sur la langue et qui étaient aussi inspirés par l'imaginaire du fleuve, par le fleuve Congo.
These are both writers who inspired me when I started writing. So I consider myself in the lineage, in the genealogy of these two poets who were very important because of the way they worked on language and also because they sought to find inspiration in the Congo River.
Et je pense aussi de manière générale, je peux dire qu'on est inspiré par la même réalité, par le même pays qui est le Congo, par la réalité sociopolitique du Congo. Donc, bien qu'il y a je me réclame de ces écrivains-là, et je suis parvenu au fil des ans à construire une lignée ou une généalogie personnelle. Je suis inspiré par le poète congolais dès le départ, Mais plus tard, depuis que je viens dans l'espace germanophone, je suis beaucoup inspiré par les écrivains allemands de l'après-guerre, les écrivains de langue allemande de l'après-guerre.
I also think that in general, I'm inspired by the same reality as these two writers. We're inspired by the same country, the Congo. We're inspired by the political reality of Congo. So while I own that universe, that I come from that world of those writers, over the years, I've created my personal genealogy, my personal lineage. And so later, I derived much inspiration from the work of post-war German writers.
Parce que le Congo actuel, c'est comme l'Allemagne et l'Autriche au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, on a une Autriche et une Allemagne démolis par la guerre, des pays qui sont vivants. Et donc, après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, les écrivains allemands ont essayé de faire un travail sur la langue, parce que la langue allemande était utilisée par les nazis. Et du coup, ils ont dû faire un travail sur la langue, mais aussi à penser, à repenser la société. Quel est le rôle de la littérature dans une société démolie par la guerre? De mon côté, je fais un travail sur la langue française qui est une langue coloniale, une ancienne langue coloniale, mais d'autre part, j'essaie de réfléchir quel est l'apport de ma littérature dans un pays démoli par la guerre. Voilà pourquoi je me situe dans cette généalogie des écrivains comme Günter Grass, comme Peter Handke ou Ingeborg Bachmann.
Après Günter Grass, je n'ai pas entendu le dernier.
Ingeborg Bachmann.
Ah, Ingeborg Bachmann, bien sûr. D'accord, j'y vais. So the current country of Congo is very similar to Austria and Germany in the post-war period. Austria and Germany had been destroyed by the war. And so after World War II, German writers had to figure out a way to work with the German language, because this was a language that has been used by the Nazis. So they were working on the language, but they also had to rethink society. What role did literature have to play in a society that was destroyed by war? So when I'm working with French, I'm dealing with a colonial language and thinking about how it fits in the society. And that's why I claim the lineage of German post-war writers, like German and Austrian writers like Peter Handke, Günter Grass, and Ingeborg Bachmann.
That's a fascinating answer, Fiston. Thank you so much. Before I turn our Zoom back over to our friends at Brookline for a final farewell, I wondered if I could ask the two of you to read one final solitude from this collection. And I was thinking about Solitude 47, and I was going to suggest that we reverse the order in which we read the poem, so that those of us whose French is a bit shaky can have some sense of what Fiston is saying as he performs it.
47, which page?
It is, sorry, Fiston, 47, Solitude 47, la page dans la version originale, je ne sais pas, on va devoir le rechercher.
C'est au début.
Mais c'est le 47. And David, I thank you for that invitation. I'll gladly take you up on it.
I got it.
OK. Il veut que je commence par l'anglais et ensuite le français. OK. Cette fois. Solitude 47. Not blood, but the Congo River sloshes in my veins. If you deny it, if you have your doubts, if you don't believe me, pick up a sharp object. A steak knife or bayonet will do, and cut me open, slice me up, skin me from belly to belly, from head to toe. You'll see what you see. The left leg of the river where my gut should be. Didn't they tell you my mouth stinks of Lake Munkamba, once infested with schistosomiasis? Didn't they tell you the Yiragongo beats in lieu of my heart? Didn't they tell you my hair is the equatorial rainforest? Didn't they tell you my tears are lava from Yamulagira? My laughter is the gusts that blow in Weniditu in Kanyama Kasese.
Solitude 47. Ce n'est pas du sang, mais plutôt le fleuve Congo qui dégringole dans mes veines. Si vous niez, si vous doutez, si vous rechignez, prenez alors un outil tranchant, un couteau à viande ou une baïonnette, et frappez-moi, et ouvrez le corps, et ouvrez mon corps, et écorchez-moi la peau, du ventre au ventre, de la tête aux pieds. Vous verrez ce que vous verrez, la jambe à gauche du fleuve en lieu et place de mes tripes. Ne vous a-t-on pas dit que ma bouche pue le lac Munkamba, jadis infecté de bilariose? Ne vous a-t-on pas dit que le Nyamulagira, c'est le Nyamulagira qui bat à la place de mon cœur? Ne vous a-t-on pas dit que c'est la forêt équatoriale qui fait office de ma chevelure? Ne vous a-t-on pas dit que mes larmes sont les larves du Nyamulagira et que mes rires 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 ne vous a-t-on pas dit que mes larmes sont les larves du Nyamulagira et que mes rires correspondent aux bourrasques qui s'ouvrent sur Mweneditu et Kanyama Kasese.
Beautiful. Thank you both. And thank you again, Nicholas. Thank you to Pierce and Ashley and to all for attending.
Thank you everyone for being here. We have River in the Belly in stores. This is a galley. This is my galley, but we have beautiful finished copies. We also have Tram 83. Thank you all so much. This was a profoundly beautiful event. I could have listened to you all for hours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'll just let people in the chat. I don't want to cut anyone off. Thank you all. Wonderful. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.